January 17th, 1945. Fort Benning, Georgia. The winter sun hung low over the pine forests of the American South, casting long shadows across the red clay earth. A convoy of olive-drab trucks rumbled through the gates of a prisoner-of-war compound, their canvas covers flapping in the cold wind. Inside, 73 German soldiers sat in silence, their gray uniforms stained with the mud of the Ardennes, their faces hollow with exhaustion and something deeper, something that resembled the final abandonment of hope. They had been told they were being transferred to a processing facility. They expected nothing. They had learned to expect nothing. For 2 years, some of them had fought across the frozen wastelands of the Eastern Front, where a can of horse meat was a luxury and frostbite claimed more men than Soviet bullets. Others had survived the hell of Normandy, where American artillery had turned the hedgerows of France into a slaughterhouse. Now, as the trucks lurched to a stop and the tailgates dropped open, they braced themselves for what came next. But what came next would shatter everything they believed about their enemy, about their war, and about the ideology that had sent them to die in foreign fields. This is not a story about victory or defeat. This is a story about the moment when the myth collided with reality, when the propaganda dissolved like smoke, when men who had been told they were the master race found themselves standing in the shadow of a truth so undeniable, so overwhelming, that it could not be explained away by any slogan, any speech, any promise of a 1,000-year Reich. This is the story of German prisoners of war who arrive in America expecting brutality and found instead something far more dangerous to everything they've been taught to believe: abundance, dignity, and the quiet, relentless power of a system that did not need to break men to prove its strength. Before we witness what unfolded behind those fences, before we see the faces of men confronting the collapse of their worldview, we must understand what they carried with them. Not in their packs. Those have been emptied long ago. But in their minds, in the stories they have been told since childhood. The prisoners stepping off those trucks in January 1945 were products of a decade of relentless indoctrination. From the moment Adolf Hitler seized power in 1933, the German propaganda machine had worked tirelessly to construct an image of the world that served a single purpose: to make young men willing to die for the Reich. And central to that image was a specific portrait of America. Not America as it was, but America as Joseph Goebbels needed it to be. A land of corruption and weakness. A mongrel nation of inferior races, ruled by Jewish financiers and crippled by the decadence of democracy. A country so soft, so divided, so spiritually bankrupt that it would collapse the moment it faced the iron will of National Socialism. German soldiers had been shown carefully edited newsreels of breadlines during the Great Depression. They had been told that American cities were cesspools of crime and racial conflict. They had been assured that the American military was a joke, a rabble of undisciplined amateurs who would break and run the moment they faced the Wehrmacht's battle-hardened legions. And most crucially, they had been taught that prisoners of war in American hands would be treated with the same savagery that defined the Eastern Front, where Soviet and German forces had waged a war of annihilation that recognized no rules, no mercy, no humanity. So when these men surrendered, when they finally accepted that the war was lost, that the promises had been lies, that they would not be returning home as heroes, they did so with a terrible certainty about what awaited them. Starvation, beatings, forced labor until their bodies gave out. Perhaps execution. They had seen what happened to prisoners on the Eastern Front. They had heard the stories from men who had been there. They knew what war did to the vanquished. They knew what they themselves had done. But now, standing in the cold Georgia sun, something was already wrong. The American guards were not screaming. They were not striking anyone. They were simply directing the prisoners toward a long, low building with hand gestures and a few words of broken German. "Dush," one of them said, pointing. "Shower." The prisoners exchanged glances. This was the moment. This was where it would begin. They had heard of the shower rooms. They knew what that word could mean. They filed into the building, their movements slow and mechanical, men walking toward what they believed might be their deaths. But inside, there were no gas chambers, no execution walls. Just rows of shower heads extending from white-tiled walls and stacks of clean towels on wooden benches. An American sergeant, his uniform crisp and his manner businesslike, explained through an interpreter that they would shower, that their clothes would be deloused, and that they would be given fresh uniforms. Hot water would be available. Soap will be provided. They should take their time. For a long moment, no one moved. The concept was too alien, too far removed from every expectation, every preparation they had made for this moment. Then, slowly, one man stepped forward, then another, and within minutes, the room was filled with the sound of running water and something that had not been heard among these men for a very long time, the sound of relief. The water was hot, not lukewarm, not the icy trickle they had known in field camps across Europe, but genuinely, abundantly hot, pouring from the shower heads with a pressure that suggested it would never run out. Men who had not bathed properly in months stood under those streams with their eyes closed, feeling the warmth soak into skin that had forgotten what comfort felt like. They had been prepared for death. They had been given hot showers. Later, after they had dressed in the clean clothing provided, sturdy denim work uniforms, not rags, they were led to a mess hall. And here, the true assault on their understanding of reality began. The room was large, well-lit, and orderly. Tables were arranged in neat rows, each set with metal trays and utensils. The smell of cooking food filled the air, not the thin gruel or ersatz coffee that had sustained them during the war's final years, but actual food. Real food. Food prepared with ingredients they had not seen since before the war began. At the serving line, American cooks, many of them African-American, which was itself a shock to men raised on Nazi racial theories, ladled out portions of roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread with butter, and coffee with real sugar. For dessert, there was apple pie. The prisoners stood in line, their metal trays extended as portion after portion was placed before them. They kept waiting for someone to tell them to stop, to say that was enough, that supplies were limited. But the portions kept coming, and when they sat down at the tables, staring at the food before them, a German officer, a major who had fought at Stalingrad and somehow survived, spoke the thought that was in every mind. This is what they feed prisoners. They ate slowly at first, afraid it might be taken away, afraid it was some kind of test or trap. But nothing happened. The guards stood at a distance, not watching them with the predatory attention of men waiting to catch an infraction, but with a kind of bored professionalism that suggested this was routine. Normal, the way things were done. And this was where the propaganda began to crack. Because these men had been hungry, not for days or weeks, but for years. The German military supply system had been collapsing since 1943, strangled by Allied bombing and the demands of a two-front war that consumed resources faster than the Reich could produce them. Frontline soldiers had been reduced to minimal rations, supplemented by whatever they could forage or steal from the territories they occupied. Many of the men in this mess hall had committed acts they would never speak of, born from the desperation of starvation. They had learned what hunger does to men, how it reduces every principle, every moral conviction to a single overwhelming need. And now they were being given 3 meals a day, not because they had earned it, not because they had value as workers or information sources, but because that was the policy, because the Geneva Convention required it, and America, despite everything they had been told, actually followed the Geneva Convention. The historical record is precise on this point. The United States Army's Provost Marshal General issued explicit orders that prisoners of war were to be treated in accordance with the 1929 Geneva Convention, which stipulated that POWs were to receive the same quality and quantity of food as garrison troops of the detaining power. This was not merely a suggestion or an aspiration. It was enforced policy, monitored by inspectors from the International Red Cross and the Swiss government, and backed by the threat of reciprocal treatment for American prisoners held by Germany. Camp commanders were required to submit detailed reports on prisoner nutrition, medical care, and living conditions. Any deviation from the standards set by the convention could result in disciplinary action. The U.S. government had made a strategic calculation that treating enemy prisoners humanely served multiple purposes. It encouraged surrender reducing American casualties. It provided moral authority in the global propaganda war. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated the fundamental difference between democratic and totalitarian systems, that America's strength did not require cruelty to prove itself. The numbers tell the story more clearly than any rhetoric. A German prisoner of war in the United States in 1945 received approximately 4,000 calories per day, more than many American civilians, and far more than the average German civilian in the bombed-out cities of the Reich, where rations have been cut to near starvation levels. The menu included meat, fresh vegetables when available, bread, butter, and coffee. Medical care was provided by qualified doctors. Barracks were heated in winter and ventilated in summer. Work was required, but it was paid work, and the hours were regulated by international law. This was not secret information. The German High Command knew how their soldiers were being treated in American camps. They knew, and they understood the danger it posed. Because every prisoner who returned to Germany after the war would be a walking testament to the lie. Every man who had eaten American food, who had slept in American barracks, who had been treated not as a subhuman enemy, but as a prisoner with rights and dignity, would carry that truth back into German society like a virus that could not be contained. In the weeks that followed, the prisoners at Fort Benning and the hundreds of other POW camps across the United States entered into a new reality. They worked, cutting timber, harvesting crops, maintaining the camps themselves, but the work was not the brutal slave labor they had expected. They were paid in camp script that could be used at the canteen, where they could purchase cigarettes, candy, and personal items. They were allowed to send and receive mail, though it was censored. They could form sports leagues, attend educational classes, and even stage theatrical productions. Some camps had symphony orchestras composed entirely of prisoners, performing concerts that were attended by local American civilians. But it was the small, mundane details that did the most damage to the worldview they had carried across the Atlantic. The towels were replaced regularly. The toilets worked. When a heating system in a barracks broke down, it was repaired within days. When a prisoner became ill, he was taken to a camp hospital where doctors, real doctors, not veterinarians pressed into service, examined him and provided treatment. If the illness was serious enough, he might be transferred to a civilian hospital, where he would receive the same care as an American patient. And there was the food. Always the food. 3 times a day, every day, without fail. The meals became the symbol, the physical manifestation of a truth that could not be denied or explained away. In the German barracks at night, men who had been strangers spoke in quiet voices about what this meant. How could a nation that fed its prisoners this well be on the verge of collapse? How could a system that treated its enemies with dignity be morally inferior to the Reich? The questions had no good answers, not if you wanted to preserve faith in the ideology that had defined your entire adult life. Consider what these men had been taught and what they found. They had been told that democracy made nations weak, that the equality promised by America was a lie that would crumble under pressure. Yet here they were, guarded by men of different races working together with a professionalism that suggested not weakness but strength. They had been assured that Jewish-controlled America would treat German prisoners with vindictive cruelty. Yet many of the camp doctors, the teachers, even some of the administrators were Jewish, and these men treated their German charges with clinical detachment, neither cruelly nor sentimentally, but as patients, as students, as human beings deserving of basic respect. They had expected brutality because brutality was what they knew. Many of these prisoners had served on the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht and the SS had participated in atrocities that would later be documented at Nuremberg. They had seen what happened to Soviet prisoners in German hands, the starvation, the exposure, the casual murder of men deemed racially inferior. By 1945, over 3 million Soviet prisoners had died in German captivity, victims of a deliberate policy of extermination through neglect. These German soldiers knew this. They had seen it, and they had assumed that what they had done would be done to them. But it wasn't, and that asymmetry gnawed at something deep in the soul. There is a documented account from a German officer held at Camp Concordia in Kansas. Lieutenant Hans Jürgen, a veteran of the Afrika Korps who had been captured in Tunisia in 1943, kept a secret diary throughout his imprisonment. In one entry from March 1945, he wrote, "Today we received news that Berlin is being bombed day and night, that our families are starving, that Germany is being destroyed. And yet we sit here, warm and fed, treated better than we treated our own allies. I do not understand this war anymore. I do not understand what we were fighting for." That confusion, that cognitive dissonance, was the weapon America wielded without even knowing it. Not tanks or planes or bombs, but the simple, relentless demonstration that a different kind of society was possible. That power did not require cruelty. That abundance was not a zero-sum game where one race prospered only by enslaving another. That perhaps, and this was the thought that kept men awake at night, perhaps everything they had been told was wrong. The symbolism of the food became almost mythological. In the barracks, men spoke of it the way medieval peasants might have spoken of a miracle. 3 meals a day, they said to each other, still disbelieving even after months of experiencing it. Every day, hot meals. It became a kind of shorthand for everything else, for the hot showers that never ran out of water, for the clean bunks and the working toilets, for the camp library stocked with books that weren't Nazi-approved propaganda, for the simple fact that they were treated as human beings rather than as vermin to be exterminated or animals to be worked to death. Some resisted. There were hardcore Nazis in the camps, men who had been in the SS or who had been true believers in the ideology. They tried to maintain discipline, to enforce the old hierarchies, to insist that this American hospitality was a trap or a temporary propaganda show that would end once the war was over. They organized secret kangaroo courts to punish prisoners who collaborated with the Americans or who spoke favorably of their captors. In some camps, there were murders, zealots killing men they deemed traitors for the crime of admitting that America was not what they had been told. But slowly, inexorably, the tide turned. Because you cannot maintain a lie in the face of daily, personal experience. You cannot convince a man that he is being oppressed when his belly is full and his body is warm. The true believers became isolated, their rants sounding increasingly hollow against the reality of the camp newspaper, the sports leagues, the educational programs teaching men skills they could use after the war. By 1945, many camps had established re-education programs, teaching German prisoners about democratic governance, about the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, about the real history that had been hidden from them by Goebbels' propaganda machine. Not all of them accepted it. Some went home to Germany after the war, still believing in the Reich, still insisting that they had fought for a righteous cause. But many more went home changed. They had seen the face of the enemy, and it had been neither cruel nor weak. It had been ordinary. It had been a farmer from Iowa who served as a camp guard and talked about his corn harvest. It had been a doctor from New York who treated a prisoner's infected wound with the same care he would give to his own family. It had been a cook from Chicago who made sure the meals were hot and ample because that was his job, and in America, you did your job right. After the war, historians and social scientists studied the phenomenon of German POWs in America, trying to understand the long-term effects of that experience. Interviews were conducted with returned prisoners, and patterns emerged. Men who had been held in American camps were statistically more likely to support democratic reforms in post-war Germany. They were more likely to question the narratives of Nazi revanchism that persisted in some quarters. They were more likely to emigrate, and when they did, America was their first choice of destination. One former prisoner, a man named Wilhelm Schultz, who had been held at a camp in Texas, later wrote a memoir about his experience. In it, he described the moment when he first realized that everything had changed. It was not during a dramatic event or a significant conversation. It was on a mundane Tuesday afternoon, during a work detail repairing a fence. He was hammering a post into the ground, and he realized he was singing, something he had not done since before the war. And the American guard nearby was not watching him with suspicion or hostility, but was reading a newspaper, occasionally glancing up to make sure everyone was working, but fundamentally disinterested in anything beyond the routine supervision of a work crew. That was when I understood, Schultz wrote, They were not afraid of us. Not because they were fools, but because they did not need to be. Their system was not fragile. It did not require constant violence to maintain itself. And we, who have been taught that only the strong survive, that mercy is weakness, that domination is the natural order, we were the ones who had been fooled. We had given everything for a lie. And the truth was hammering fence posts in Texas under a hot sun, while a guard read about baseball scores and did not think we were worth hating. The war ended. The camps began to empty. Prisoners were repatriated in stages, shipped back across the Atlantic to a Germany that no longer existed, not as they had known it. The cities were rubble. The Reich was divided between occupying powers. The currency was worthless. Food was scarce, and millions of returning soldiers and prisoners brought with them stories that did not match the official narrative of noble defeat. The men who had been in American camps had a particularly difficult adjustment. They returned to communities devastated by bombing and starvation, where black market bread cost a month's wages, where families lived in cellars of destroyed buildings, where every day was a struggle to survive. And they remembered the food, the hot showers, the barracks that had been warmer than the ruins they now called home. Some felt guilt for having been safe while their family suffered. Others felt anger that they had been lied to, that they had sacrificed for a regime that had left them with nothing but ash and trauma. But beneath those immediate emotions, something deeper was taking root. A generation of German men who had seen America not as an abstraction or a propaganda caricature, but as a lived reality. They had worked alongside American guards, had been treated by American doctors, had eaten food produced by American farms. They had learned English words. They had heard American music. They had absorbed, perhaps without fully realizing it, a different set of assumptions about how societies function, about the relationship between individuals and the state, about what was possible. This was not a complete transformation. Germany did not become a carbon copy of America. But in the rebuilding of West Germany, in the establishment of democratic institutions, in the remarkable economic recovery of the 1950s and 60s, there were echoes of what those prisoners had learned. The understanding that prosperity need not be built on conquest. That cooperation could be more powerful than domination. That the true measure of a nation's strength was not how brutally it could treat its enemies, but how humanely it could afford to treat them. By 1946, the last of the POW camps in the United States had closed. The barracks were dismantled or converted to other uses. The mess halls fell silent. The places where hundreds of thousands of German and Italian prisoners had lived out the wars and returned to farmland, to forest, to the ordinary American landscape. But the memory remained, preserved in letters, in photographs, in the testimonies of men who had experienced something that should not have been possible according to everything they had been taught. There is a final image worth preserving, a small detail that encapsulates the larger truth. In several of the camps, toward the end of the war, prisoners were allowed to plant gardens. Victory gardens, they were called, though the term had different meanings for the prisoners than for their guards. They grew vegetables, tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, in small plots beside the barracks. They tended these gardens in their free time, working soil that was not their own, growing food they did not need because they were already fed, doing it simply because they could, because it was something normal and human and ordinary.